Okay, let's get into this oppressed and oppressor language. Yeah, okay, we'll spend the last bit of our time today dealing with this oppressed and oppressor language. Oppressed and oppressor, the language itself is meant to trigger your anti-Marxian instincts. I'm not here to be pro-Marxian. Let's talk about oppression. Let's stack a series of, I wish I had a graphic. Let's stack a series of dominoes, right? With the Christian worldview in mind. Let's start with the first domino. The first domino is power. Let's talk about power. Power in a society is inevitable. There's no society that exists where everyone who is a part of that society has the same amount of influence and power. There's no such place. Even in heaven, God is the king. He has more power than we will have when we get to heaven. There's no society where power is not a dynamic. That's inevitable, unchangeable. Send me an email of a society that has a civilization that doesn't have a breakdown between influence. So if we can agree that power is an inevitable of any society, then that means that we have a natural breakup of the influencers and those who have more influence than other people. There's some people who can change things, and there's some people who are the subjects that have to deal with change. There's some people who can move things, who can establish things, who can bring things to be. They can their power. They have influence. They have power. And there's other people who don't have that same level of power. So power exists, and as a result of power existing, there is a stratosphere of power as a result of that. Then not everybody has the same one, so therefore there is not power equity. There is power differential. There's power disparity. That every society has a disparity of power. Let's just settle with that. Okay. So if we can, if so far you're with me, power exists inevitably. Because of inevitable power shifts, no situation has shared power equally, socially, right? But there's a stratosphere. Okay, now let's throw the Christian view in to say, hey, we're all totally depraved, sinners by nature, self-interested and selfish by our very nature. Then those who have the power to serve their interests are likely to serve their own interests at the expense of or irregardless to the means of or thoughts of those who do not. Power exists inevitably. Stratosphere of power is inevitable in every society. We are all sinners, self-interested. Therefore, if I have the power to produce my own self-interest, to advance my own self-interest, then I will do that, even if it means oppressing or taking away from those who are beneath me. Now, that's the part you're like, no, that doesn't necessarily mean that. Well, then what you're saying is that those who have power have some innate non-sin in their nature. Something about those who have power who just are not self-interested at all. They're just, they think about everybody. They make decisions that have everyone in mind. Well, no, number one, that's not the way we think we act. And number two, it sounds like that's not even what we want people to do. Certainly in America, most people are just like, look, I don't want to think about everybody. I want to just think about me. Right? So if there's a power differential, and because of that power differential, there's a space where people have in them the sin of self-interest and greed and selfishness and self-advancement, then they're going to exercise whatever power influence they have in their possession to pursue their own interests. That formula creates an oppressor and oppressive, an oppressed and oppressor dynamic. I would make the case, let's say not oppressor and oppressed. What it creates is, well, yeah, I think it does. If we're going to add sin to power, then you create oppress and oppressor. Now, again, you got to stay away from the extreme versions of oppress and oppressor, because when you think about oppress and oppressor, you might be thinking about Saddam Hussein, or you might be thinking about Osama bin Laden, or you might be thinking about Adolf Hitler or some some tyrannical version. But if you live in a space where there's power differential and we're all selfish and greedy, then that means that every person is working to their own best interests at the expense of their neighbor's best interest, which creates a me versus you survival of the fittest scenario. Well, yes, that means that the strong is at the top and the weaker at the bottom, or the powerful is at the top and the powerless is at the bottom, or the oppressor is at the top or the oppressed is at the bottom. Now, these are neutral terms. You don't have to be angry about that. That's just the way society is. So the challenge is not to say, man, we don't live in a power society, because we do. And the challenge is not to say that we're prone to oppression, because we are. The Bible tells us that. That's what the scriptures reveal to us about ourselves, is that we're sinners and that we're selfish interested by nature. Some people say insufferably so, that there's no way for us to not be that. And if that's the case, then that means societies are prone to have varying levels of oppression and oppressor groups in them. So we need not be concerned and alarmed by the presence of that dynamic in our society, even as Christians. If you follow the formula, it's what you would expect if the Bible is true. Now the question comes, what do we do with that power? What happens when the change of the heart happens in the individual, and suddenly those who have power are no longer interested in furthering their own best interests, but they actually are interested in taking care of the other person, thinking collectively? What happens when that happens? And the scriptures they tell us that we ought to care for the other. Like that the product of a changed heart is a change of the direction of our motive, certainly socially. So that now that you have a system where power differential is real, you can't avoid it. Some people are going to have more power than others, but like Jesus said to the disciples, but the powerful don't lord their power over those who they have power over, but instead they serve. That's what the scripture says. And that the first becomes last and the last becomes first. And suddenly the thing that happens with power doesn't have to be oppressive. It could be service. In fact, it turns out that the person who has the most power has the most opportunity to serve, to be a blessing to others. That's what the scripture is teaching us. The scripture is teaching us to lay down our self-interest and pick up the interest of our neighbor, of the other, right? So when critical race theory comes and says, hey, we live in a system that has oppressed and oppressor, you don't need to go back to Karl Marx and be like, hey, Karl Marx was the inventor of the concept of oppress and oppressor. No, you don't even need Karl Marx. Just look at the scriptures themselves and follow the dominoes to say, we are born as sinners. We collect each other. Power dynamics are a feature of society, of every society. And as a feature of every society, and the fact that we're sinner, we're likely to create a system that holds some people down in order to prop those up who have power, because that is what serves the interest of the powerful. And without Christ, that is the system that we're in. That is the natural, predictable outcome of a Christless system. And then Christian comes in and says, okay, we can't change the power dynamic. We can't change this. So what we want to do is change the heart direction of the people who are making the laws, who have the power, to make sure that they cover everyone. And this is what has made America great, because America is the closest we've gotten to that, at least on the it's the closest we've gotten to it, at least on paper, from Constitution, once we got the Civil Rights Act stuff going, right? Starting in the 60s. It's the closest thing we got to understanding that, hey, there is a power differential, but we're going to try to spread that out so that every voice matters in a democracy, and that everyone gets to speak into what happens. And the chief among us are going to be those who represent us, not themselves. the Senate, the U.S. representatives, and their job, they're given their power not to pursue their own ideas, but to pursue the ideas of the constituency with which they represent. And therefore, their power is in service to others, not their own individual selves. So America is set up to be close to pull this thing off. And so people like me are looking at it like, man, there's a great opportunity for us to do this, and we're missing it. And this concept of oppress and oppressor has gotten in the way because people immediately associate oppress with Marx and Marxism. And next thing you know, we're down the rabbit trail of communism, which is an unnecessary feature of the conversation. We need not do that. Oppress and oppressor is a biblical concept that is the product of sin, collective sin, in a civilization where power dynamics are existent and sin is inevitable.